I'd like to start off by asking you all to close your eyes. And imagine for a moment that you lived unseen and unheard by those around you, by your parents, your teachers, your peers. What would it be like if you were invisible to the rest of humanity? You can open your eyes now. Maybe some of you do. This is what life was like for my adopted sister, who lived unseen and unheard for most of her life. My sister would often stare at people and I'd wonder why. And she once told me of a story that left a profound impact on me. It was about a group of strangers eating and laughing together. And when I asked her, she said something that I will never forget. She said, "But Sophie, they will never see me. I don't exist for them." And I didn't realize until that moment that she stared because she felt invisible. When people go through extreme conditions such as deep poverty that my sister did, we tend to dehumanize them. And we do this in order to disconnect from their pain. But in so doing, we take away their humanity. And for my sister who lived in some of the most unspeakable conditions, she was too ashamed to ever speak of them until we broke the silence. She felt truly seen, and it taught me a powerful lesson. That sometimes when we give people who don't have a voice a platform, and we allow them to speak the unspeakable, that is what's going to take us from darkness into light. So I want to start off today by talking to you why it's so important for all of us to feel seen and heard. And to do that, I'd like to share my personal journey with you. I started off my career, much like many of you here, in my 20s. I was young, idealistic. I was passionate about making a difference in the world. And so when an opportunity came open to volunteer with the United Nations, I packed up, left my adopted country in Canada, and I went to volunteer in Africa. And what was supposed to happen just a few months turned into years as I got promoted. And while I saw some of the most heartbreaking conditions in this part of the world, I felt like I was making a meaningful impact. And so life was good for a time. I met my husband there. We started to form a family. And then the call came. It was to go to Geneva. And I was excited because it was a global leadership position and I was going to get to make a difference for women and children all over the world. So I packed up yet again and I left. But when I got there, I felt disillusioned, lost. Felt like I had no voice. For one thing, I was a woman of color and there was no one that looked like me at the top. And I noticed that others also felt similar experiences, especially women and those who've been marginalized. So I had to find out why. Why was I feeling so lost? And I did some deep soul searching. And it led me to discover a pattern I'd held on to for most of my life. And it was a pattern of a narrative of silence. I noticed that this happened 3 major times in my life. And the first time it happened was as a child refugee. So when we fled Ethiopia, I was about 6 years old. At the time, the country was blowing up in a massive oppressive regime. And my parents, who were freedom fighters, decided it was safer to leave. And they knew they couldn't take us with them because the authorities would get suspicious. So they sent for strong family networks to get us out. At the time, my adopted sister was about 16. I was about 6. My brother was 4, and my sister was 2. And so the night came when we had to make the journey. And it was the middle of the night, and I remember very vividly getting inside of a pickup truck, packed with way too many strangers, just like in those stories that you hear of migrants making their way across in a dangerous way, literally hanging over the sides. So we make our way across to Kenya. And when we get there, the thing that we had not expected happens. And my sister, the money that she had was lost and stolen. And overnight, we became stranded in East Africa as children with no money, no food. This period lasted for 2 months, which, as you can imagine, is a long time for children. We had to sneak into people's backyards to get food. And sometimes we'd get chased out, and other times we'd have kind strangers who'd give us shelter. Finally, an aunt came. She found us, and she took us to Somalia, where we would be relatively safer. But when we get there, for the first time, I experienced silencing, because Ethiopia and Somalia were at war with each other, and I was not safe to be who I was. My identity was not safe. Sometimes we'd get stoned, and other times I'd have to hide under the bed from soldiers. But there was good news. Finally, UNHCR, which is a UN agency dedicated to helping refugees, helped us to seek asylum to Canada. And for the first time, I met my parents in 2.5 years. This is a picture of us meeting the day at the airport. And I will never forget that day because the biggest fear I had until then for those 2.5 years was that I would forget their face. And I was so happy that I hadn't. And my parents just fell to the floor, just relieved and happy to see us. And so for a time, we made Canada our home and life stabilized. And that was silence number 1. The second time that I felt silenced, I was a 12-year-old girl. And by this point, I had made Canada my home. And the biggest challenge I had was learning a new language. I had trying to create a sense of belonging. And the biggest stressor that I had was in watching my parents start their career at the very bottom, just like most migrants, and trying to make ends meet for 4 children. At the time, we were living in a house, and I was living with an uncle. And there was always something off about this uncle, but I couldn't express what. It took me years to realize that he was an alcoholic. And that because I grew up in a Muslim household, we never spoke about alcoholism. It was too shameful. And so the day that he started to sexually abuse me, I was muted with silence. The only person that knew was my 8-year-old sister, who would bravely try to get her little body in between us to distract him. And this lasted for 2 years. 2 years of living in absolute terror in my own home, of not knowing when the doors would be broken down. So when the truth came out, I told a friend. The friend told the teacher. The teacher told the police because I was a minor. And overnight, the police showed up at my door, and my life had flipped upside down. I'd lost control. The most difficult part of it all, though, was in the way that my community and family handled it. They wanted it to go away. They felt it was too shameful. And they never wanted to speak about it. But what that does to a young girl is that it tells her that she is not important, that she brings shame, and that she is unworthy. The other thing that it did was it brought self-blame and guilt. And I found it ironic that I was more worried about other children's pain than I was of myself, and I was a child myself. Shame makes us do strange things. But the most strange is the desire to disappear. Brené Brown defines shame as the intensely painful feeling, a feeling that we are flawed and unworthy of love and belonging. But the most powerful thing that she says to me is that shame derives its power from the unspeakable. That's essentially what I had done. I had given my power to the unspeakable. And that was silence number 2. Now, the third and final time that I was silenced, I was a woman in the workplace, working in a hierarchical organization. And by this point, you see, I had brought my fear of authority into the picture. I never questioned it. And so I will never forget when a female mentor made me realize how complicit I was in this narrative. She made me realize that I was the one who silenced myself. Maybe when I was young, I needed this fear to stay alive. But as a woman, I no longer needed it. It was a first step in taking ownership of my story. And it was an absolute turning point. You see, up until then, what I was actually looking for was a sense of my own personal power. Up until then, I had been taught that power was external to me, and it was provided in the social positions that I held. But the kind of power that I wanted was deeply inherent. It was so powerful that it moved the masses and needed no justification. And best of all, no one could ever take it away. When I thought about the best examples of personal power, I thought of Nelson Mandela. This man was able to find freedom by changing the one thing he could, and that was his mind. And I love this quote that showed the kind of personal power he connected to. So the day that I found freedom was the day that I got myself out of isolation. I started to speak to other women. I created a women's network group. I started to talk to each other about what the challenges they experienced, and I realized I wasn't alone. And what that did was it got me out of my shame. I joined forces with other women in New York headquarters. We started to amplify and raise our voice as one. I recognized the power for the first time, the power of the female community. And best of all, I noticed there was a ripple effect, that the more I spoke up, the more others did too. Up until that point, there were other women who were scared to report abuse of power. And when I started to speak up, they started to stand up for themselves. The other thing that I did to find my voice was I broke the silence about the sexual abuse. I had to go to the dark spots to bring the unspeakable to the speakable. But when I did, for the first time, my mother told me that she had been sexually abused at the age of 5. Horribly so, that my adopted sister multiple times abused by the age of 10. My other sister also abused. It went even further. My grandmother, my great-grandmother, my aunts, my female cousins. In the midst of the sadness, I was angry. This was a generational issue. And I kept asking myself, was I carrying my mother's wounds without ever having spoken about it? Is it possible to pass on silence to future generations? Enough. Enough giving our power away. Enough fear of making others uncomfortable. Enough holding on to shame that wasn't ours to begin with. At the time, my daughter was having trouble speaking. And I thought I caused it somehow. And it brought me real shame. My mother thought she was protecting us, but we cannot protect with silence. We cannot. And so I had to speak up for her, my daughter. I had to teach her to speak up for herself. And I made a pact with myself then that I was going to break the cycle and that I was going to prevent future generation of girls from ever feeling that their voice didn't matter. And that when somebody did something to hurt them, that they can call it out and they'd be heard. This ripple effect eventually led me to create TruVoice. TruVoice is a place where every woman can be seen and heard, where she no longer has to carry blame or shame. It's ultimately a safe place for them to speak the unspeakable. It's also a place where leaders can learn how to lead with a sense of grace and humanity and create space for others. All of you will have your own disempowering narratives. For some, it will be about abandonment, and others may be about victimhood. For me, it was giving power to the silence. And I found my true voice. I broke the cycle. Because when we are all seen for who we are, and we drop our veils in order to truly connect, that is what's going to change the world. So I leave you with these 3 questions. How will you recognize your own disempowering narrative? How will you allow yourself to be truly seen? And how will you speak the unspeakable? Thank you.